the end of World War II, and kind of coupled this together with the Cold War, because as World War II is ending, the Cold War is actually heating up. Basically, we rid ourselves of one dictator, and we're left with two superpowers, and so we'll talk about that, all right? Now, first little thing we have here, we have what is called, the Battle of the Bulge. This is the last real major German offensive. It's kind of Hitler's last stand. He's going to put everything he has into this, and it is by far the bloodiest battle the Americans have seen. It's also the largest tank battle in history. Here's the idea of the Battle of the Bulge. And so you have the Germans there, and they were coming into Luxembourg and France and all these different areas, and it was a massive thing to get them to turn around. Once they do, the Germans will begin to flee back in from the west. Remember that the Americans have already invaded Italy, and so we're pushing from the south. We've already invaded kind of southern France, and so we're coming in that way. And so this is spelling the end of the Germans. Now, as we get into Berlin, the number one thing we want is we want Hitler. And as you can see here by the newspaper, we assume Hitler is dead. Now, there's some conspiracy there, number one, because we never found a body. He did have an underground bunker, and once we went in there, we found a gun on a sofa. You can see there, right? And as the story is believed to go, and for most intents and purposes, not conspiracy, Hitler and his mistress, Eva Braun, committed suicide and then ordered the guards to dismember or burn their bodies, and then the guards were to shoot themselves as well. And so, truth be told, we're really not going to know whatever happens there, but Hitler is dead at this point. And so, once Germany does surrender unconditionally, VE Day is proclaimed, and VE basically means victory in Europe. And so you have this, Germany surrenders. Now the problem is, remember, we're still fighting elsewhere. Okay, now this is 1945, so prior to this I have to let you in on a little something. Prior to all this happening, Battle of the Bulge, etc., FDR in 1944 will be elected to his fourth term. However, shortly thereafter he does pass away, and his vice president, Harry S. Truman, becomes president. Now, I'm going to save a lot here when we get to the 40s and talk about his style. He is completely different than FDR in the sense that FDR liked to have discussions, etc. Truman was a man about, I'm going to make all the decisions, and I like it that way, okay? And so we'll get into him. Now, the number one thing he inherits in 1945 is the battle with Japan. What on earth are we going to do about Japan? And so there's a lot of interesting things here. Let's get into it, okay? As you can see from his desk, he has a different style. He has that placard on his desk which says, "The buck stops here," correct? Now, there used to be a saying called "pass the buck, pass the blame." He's basically saying the blame, the decisions, everything stops here at this desk. And so he's not really consultative, as I said. He's going to basically set up and do the things he wants. Now, island hopping has been successful to this point. We're pushing the Japanese back to their actual island. However, as we get closer and closer, the battles will get bloodier and bloodier. And the first place we come upon is Iwo Jima. Now, as you can tell, Iwo Jima has a giant volcano right here, correct? And this makes it a tactical nightmare, because anywhere we pull up, the Japanese are probably going to be on this high ground and can shoot and can inflict massive casualties. So we're going to embark on another very bloody mission, similar to the idea of D-Day, where we have the amphibious land, etc. And we will win. Now, the telling picture of Iwo Jima is this one, and you've probably seen this before, correct? The story is that the flag man carried the flag into battle, was wounded, and he was trying to get up to the top of the volcano to replace the Japanese one. 3 Marines saw this going on and ran to his aid. Now, the Marines use this picture, and they use it under a quote that says, "Uncommon valor was a common virtue," meaning bravery you didn't see every day was present in all these men. It had to be, okay? Now, as they're getting bloodier and worse, we start having new tactics and new things developed to maybe inflict greater damage without losing so many troops. The first such thing was a substance known as napalm. If you've ever played World of War, what is that game called? Call of Duty, sorry. You will know napalm is a horrible stuff. Napalm is basically jellied gasoline. What that means is when it hits, it will stick and it will burn to whatever it sticks. Okay? So we decided to use napalm in some overnight attacks in Japan, and here's one city that's smoking. Now, why was it so effective? Because the Japanese cities were what they called wooden cities. They really didn't have the steel. Remember, they don't have the resources. They do have trees, and so a lot of their houses and stuff, etc., is made of wood. So this napalm is highly destructive. And I'll show you a video from Robert McNamara, who was in the Air Force at this time, later becomes very important in the 60s in Vietnam, and he set up analytics for this, and he does a way of comparing the Japanese cities with American cities, and says, well, what if 50% of this had been burned? And I bring up 50 because he says that Tokyo is roughly the size of New York City, and they burned 50% of Tokyo with these napalm. And he said, imagine we wake up the next day and 50% of New York City is gone. And so that's kind of where he is there. Now, this is not McNamara's call to make, but rather the man in charge of the Air Force, and his name is Curtis LeMay. So Curtis LeMay is a general commander of the Air Force, and he is kind of behind the more destructive decisions, napalm and later the atomic bomb, which we'll get into, okay? Now, why are we invading these islands? We need to get as close as possible to Japan if we're going to launch an invasion. Ultimately, the Japanese are pushing back, and so we took Iwo Jima, but it's still too far away. And so, as you can see here, the last island that is really close to Japan is an island called Okinawa. There's now a military base there for the United States. So we decided we're going to take Okinawa as a staging area to launch an invasion on the Japanese. And again, it's an amphibious kind of landing of boats, and it's kind of crazy. Once here, and once we start kind of looking at the casualties from Iwo Jima and Okinawa, decisions are starting to be made of, if we invade Japan by troop, we are going to have a vast increase in casualties. We're going to have thousands upon thousands of soldiers dead, and a lot of people are calling for another method, and there had actually been something planned for this, and I'm going to get into what that secret plan was here in a second.